When this young woman gave birth to two healthy twins, she had no idea that just a week later, she would get a call that would shock her world. She was over the moon seeing their faces for the first time, especially since she started this pregnancy with a special purpose. Everything seemed fine, and she and the twins were allowed to go home the same day. But then the doctor called with shocking news. Woman gives birth to healthy twins. A week later, the doctor calls her with shocking news. It was the 2nd of October, and it rained on the day when Judith delivered the two most beautiful girls in the world. She carried both Rose and Lily inside her belly for 9 months and 1 week, and now it was time to say hi to the world for both of them. They had a destination to go to because Judith wasn't just a normal pregnant woman. She was a surrogate mother. The delivery was hard but worth it. The exhausted mother lay in her hospital bed, and when she had a little rest, it was time to see the little girls properly. She asked the doctor who helped deliver the babies if she could see them. The lovely man obliged, and both girls were placed on Judith's belly. It was a special moment, even more so when a young couple walked into the room. The two people walking into Judith's room were very familiar to her. They were the reason she was in the hospital, after all. Judith smiled and welcomed Angela, whom she called Angie, and her husband, Brad. The smiling surrogate mother asked her best friend if she wanted to take a closer look at her new babies. It was a question with an immediate response. Yes. Angie replied while crying from happiness. The young couple thanked Judith from the bottom of their hearts. Their best friend made a 9-month-long sacrifice and went through labor just for this moment. It wasn't something they took lightly. "Can I hold them?" Angie asked carefully while staring into the eyes of her best friend. "But, of course," was Judith's response. Not knowing that she had to make the hardest decision of her life 1 week from now. Judith watched from her hospital bed as she saw Brad and Angie kiss and hug their new family additions. They presented doctors and Judith with their chosen names for the girls, and everything seemed perfect, like nothing in the world could go wrong. Judith smiled and reflected on the moment when all of this started. The moment when she was asked to become a surrogate mother. And what a day that was. Judith remembered that day vividly. It was the start of a long journey in which her body changed and her friendship with Angie grew. The phone rang and the caller ID presented Angie's name. Judith answered and could hear that her friend was very nervous. She fumbled with her words and needed multiple breaks between sentences. Eventually, she asked that she wanted Judith to come over, but she wouldn't exactly say why. Once there, Angie invited Judith inside her house. Judith always loved being there. It was such a homely place, with only one thing missing. And Angie was about to explain why that was. It was the saddest revelation, but sometimes, the universe just wasn't kind to those deserving. Angie explained that she and Brad have wanted children for years now. But after Infinite tries to do it the natural way, Angie's womb remained empty. Angie said that doctors said that there was nothing wrong with their fertility. It was just that her womb wouldn't take a life. It was heartbreaking to us when the doctor explained that having children the normal way wasn't going to be possible for us, Angie said. But according to their doctor, they could try one other method. And it revolved around asking a surrogate mother for help. And we want to ask you, Judith. Both Angie and Brad understood that this was an overwhelming request. It was way more than either of them could ever ask of Judith, so they didn't expect an answer immediately. Just take all the time you need to think this over. And remember that if you say no, we will understand completely. Judith looked at her best friend since high school without blinking for a long time. And then she surprised both of them. Unlike Angie, Judith was still single. She didn't mind, it was a lifestyle she had chosen. She felt the desire to have kids of her own and was happy to be by herself. But what did give Judith a sense of purpose in life was being the best friend in the world. That's why she didn't even have to think about it. Judith looked at the couple and said yes on the spot. Judith's amazing and, most of all, sudden answers shocked Brad and Angie. They were not counting on their friend to come to their rescue so soon. But they couldn't argue with the end result. They stood up from their chair and hugged Judith at the same time. But they did not know that this pregnancy would work out much differently and bizarrely than any of them could have ever expected. Shortly after they talked about the details amongst each other, the long procedure could commence. And that all started with a visit to their favorite doctor. Dr. Matthews was an experienced physician in his early 50s and knew Angie's family very well. This man also delivered the baby for my older sister, Angie told Judith in the car ride over. The hospital doors opened, and the nervous trio walked inside. The man in his white garment invited the three of them inside his office and told Judith to take the seat closest to him since she was the one who had to carry the child for 9 months. He could sense that Judith was nervous and did his best to calm the future pregnant woman down. "It will all be fine. This is a very simple procedure. Shall I explain what we're planning to do?" Dr. Matthews explained the basic steps of IVF first. "We are going to extract sperm cells from Brad and some egg cells from Angela. And we are going to combine them in a lab-like environment. From there, we will let the cells merge, and outside of your womb, we will already start forming them into tiny embryos. We will do this with multiple embryos, and I will explain to you why." The doctor stated that it was almost always the case that most of the embryos didn't pass the first stages of life. So if we are lucky, we will end up with one viable growing embryo inside you. We only place multiple ones simultaneously to increase the odds of that happening. But don't be disappointed if it doesn't take the first time. Judith understood and thanked the doctor for his clear explanation, but, well, that wasn't exactly how things turned out. Judith lay in her hospital bed and could only smile as she watched her best friend stroll around with a fresh set of twins. Judith looked at Dr. Matthews and gave him a satisfied grin. They both knew what it meant. Never rely too much on numbers, nature can take strange turns. But that wasn't the end of this, because a shocking surprise waited around the corner. Because this miscalculation in the number of children Judith ended up having was not the reason why Dr. Matthews called her just 1 week later. The news that the phone call brought with it was far more shocking, and it would change the life of the young Judith forever. He also called her specifically and chose not to notify the new parents, Angela and Brad. And he had a good reason for doing so. Judith and the twins were sent home the very same day. Everything went by smoothly, so hospital staff didn't see any reason for them to occupy a room anymore. Judith shook Dr. Matthews' hand and was rolled out of the hospital by her best friend, Angie. They left the hospital together, but at the end of the day, Angie, Brad, and the kids went to their house. And Judith returned home alone. When Judith entered her house that very same day, she still had a smile on her face. First of all, she was glad that the labor part was over because it simply hurt. But mostly, she was happy that she had provided the children her friends so desperately wanted. As time passed, though, her facial expression changed. Judith thought back on her pregnancy and experienced an unexpected emotional response to the whole thing. Before Judith started this pregnancy, she had never desired children. She even mentioned it multiple times to her best friend, Angie. She was just happy to be single. Judith was the one who could go to parties every week and go out with no responsibility to others but herself. But somehow, the life that grew inside her belly changed Judith. She kind of bonded with them weirdly, Judith said aloud. Judith sat at home and felt sad. She wanted to see the kids and her friend again, even though she promised to give them space at first. You can imagine the joy on Judith's face when it turned out that Angie felt the same way. They were so close the last 9 months that this separation felt weird. But after Judith saw the twins and Angie again, Judith knew she had made the right choice. But what Judith did not know was that something bizarre was happening back at her own home. She happily chatted with her friends and hugged and kissed the kids at Angie and Brad's place. But back home, the landline in her living room was going berserk. Someone was trying to reach her, and not just one time. And Judith was shocked once she found out what this caller had to say. Judith drove home again after her much-needed visit to Angie's place. Seeing Rose and Lily again was something that just needed to happen. She needed to see the twins in their new environment with their new mom and dad. Now, Judith could get some closure and move on with her life. "Back to my cozy one-bedroom single house," Judith said while driving. But when she opened the door, the answering machine lit up. Judith never got a call on her landline, so the blinking light piqued her interest instantly. "Who could be calling?" she said as she walked up to the device. She had a curious smile on her face when she stepped closer, but the message on the machine turned that frown upside down instantly. It was Dr. Matthews. He asked Judith to call her back immediately, and he sounded panicky. When Judith called the doctor, he answered almost immediately, which was unusual, to say the least. Dr. Matthews spoke hastily and fumbled most of his words while talking, so much so that Judith needed to calm him down before continuing the conversation. "I'm sorry, but it's hard to follow you, sir. Is there something wrong?" Dr. Matthews apologized and promised to calm down a bit. But there indeed was something wrong. It took a while for the doctor to fully calm down, and during that time tension within Judith only rose. He said that there was something wrong, the last thing you want to hear when you just delivered babies a week ago. "What is it, doctor?" "Please don't keep me in suspense," Judith now said nervously. Dr. Matthews answered by saying that after the children were born, they discovered something that changed everything. "What did you discover?" Judith's voice grew louder as the conversation went on. She asked why Dr. Matthews decided to call her instead of Angie and Brad, since they were now the twins' parents. The phone line went silent for a few seconds after Judith asked that question, and when Dr. Matthews finally broke it, he started his sentence with a long, deep breath. "Because what we found is specifically about you. I know all of this is still very vague, which raises more questions than answers." "I'm sorry about that," Dr. Matthews said. But he had a good reason for his secrecy. This news was too big to simply convey over the phone, plus he needed to show Judith some stuff because otherwise, she surely would never believe him. "Can you come to the hospital as soon as possible? And please come alone." Judith had no choice but to agree to Dr. Matthews' request. "I will get in my car right now and drive your way," she stated. The doctor thanked her and said that he would wait for her arrival. Judith waited no time. She grabbed her keys and put on the first coat she could find. With her foot on the gas pedal, she rushed over to the hospital where, hopefully, answers were waiting. That car ride to the hospital felt like the longest ride of Judith's life. She needed to pay attention to the road, but all the anxiety in her mind made it hard to focus. She desperately wanted to call her friend Angie about the call, but Dr. Matthews stated that this discovery was only for her eyes. Every mile her car came closer to the building increased Judith's nerves. What the hell is going on? While driving, the young ex-surrogate mothers started to speculate about the things that could be wrong with her or the babies. "They took blood from both me and the children." The doctor said that it was common practice when it came to surrogate mothers. "Maybe they found something in our blood." A sign above the road stated that the hospital was only 5 miles away. Almost there, the nervous Judith spoke to herself. When Judith saw that sign, she pushed the gas pedal deeper. She knew she was speeding, but hardly anyone was on the road, and she could take the tension much longer. Her speculation continued, even though she knew nothing good could come from it. "The doctor informed me that both of the girls were perfectly healthy. But what if they weren't? And why the hell did he only call me?" With squeaking tires, Judith's car arrived at the hospital. The young and worried woman sprung out and ran toward the front desk of the doctor's office. She hoped she could skip the line, but she wasn't hopeful because the hospital waiting room tended to let you sit there for long stretches. She told the woman behind the desk that Dr. Matthews asked her to come in immediately. "Apparently, it's urgent?" However, the woman behind the desk did not seem too impressed by Judith's hasty demeanor. She told the nervous woman to sit down in waiting room number 2. "From there, the doctor will meet you as soon as possible. I do have to warn you, though. It's a busy day today." Judith sat down in the waiting room chair. Her body felt at least 3 times heavier than normal. But luck was on her side. because after not even a full minute, the doctor's office flew open. He was about to help another patient when his eyes fell on Judith. "Sorry, sir, but you must wait a bit longer. This is very important." He gestured toward Judith, indicating that he wanted her to come inside. "Have a seat," he said while clearing his desk from the now delayed male patient's case. After that, Dr. Matthews opened a drawer. He was restless, probably because he didn't expect Judith to arrive this fast. The white-robed man ruffled through files in the drawer and eventually pulled a thing off the white file. He placed the thing on his desk and started unwinding the small piece of rope that held the documents together. It took a god-awful long time, which made the tension mount just too high for Judith. "Please tell me what's wrong, sir." The doctor started talking while unwinding and said that after the babies were born, they took blood from both Judith and the children. And with that blood, they did a DNA test. It's very standard to execute those tests when we're dealing with surrogate motherhood, Dr. Matthews made clear. But what was less clear were the results they found when inspecting the DNA test. "Frankly, I'm pretty shocked even," the doctor said. "Shocked? Is it that bad? Are the babies all right?" This was bad, and she knew it, or was she jumping to conclusions? The doctor folded open the file he had on Judith and the implanted children, and he assured her once more that the children were 100% healthy. It was true at birth, and they are still healthy today. But they found something else that really needed her attention. "We have a problem." Dr. Matthews stated that after the DNA samples came back, they found out that the two babies did not share the same DNA. They weren't identical, so that made sense, Judith thought. But it went a little bit further than that. Dr. Matthews then made his big reveal. "One of the babies holds 50% of your DNA, which should be impossible when a baby is implanted. But it makes you her biological mother." "What? One of them is my biological daughter? How is that possible?" When Judith heard this news, she was completely left in shock. She definitely did not share the bed with her best friend's husband, and she was there herself when doctors implanted the already formed embryos. She simply did not understand how this could have happened. "Doctor, you guys told me that this procedure was watertight. How can this be?" Judith thought aloud at that point and assumed that Brad's sperm cell could have merged with her own egg cell. "Is this a possibility, doctor?" But Dr. Matthews shook his head and said there was zero possibility of that happening. They implanted an already fertilized embryo, so there was nothing to merge with. And besides, DNA tests show that Brad is not the father. The plot thickened after that remark. Not the father? Who else could it be? It wasn't like 50% of DNA appeared out of thin air, right? Dr. Matthews looked up from his file and stared into the confused woman's eyes. She was sobbing, and her skin had turned pale. He took a deep breath and tried to explain the only option, his professional opinion. DNA tests show that one of the babies is 100% Angela and Brad's biological child, but the other child consists of DNA from you and an unknown man. We don't have DNA samples of the male participant, so we cannot test it on anybody. Judith now understood why the doctor asked her to come in alone. She was placed in an awkward spot because her best friends were raising her biological child. Judith's wondering thoughts were then interrupted when Dr. Matthews presented another revelation. And this revelation shed some light on the case. So much so that it even cracked it wide open. He stated that the test showed that this child was almost a full week older than the other baby, which was impossible when conceived at the same time. At first, this revelation caused even more confusion with the ex-surrogate mother. If everything about this was impossible, how was she sitting here now? Dr. Matthews continued by saying this was extremely rare, but he read about one similar case in Canada. When a woman has sex, and the merging of an egg cell and sperm cell is successful, the womb makes room for the combined cells to nestle and grow. But the problem is that it doesn't close right away. So when we entered your womb and manually brought in a second embryo, it accepted it as well. The doctor explained that the first merging of cells could only have happened moments before the hospital staff inserted Angela and Brad's child. So, Judith, is it possible that you had sex in the week before the procedure? It was an invasive question, but given the circumstances, it was a valid one to ask. And she could reply instantly because she did have a one-night stand about a week before the procedure. Dr. Matthews nodded and said that this was the only possibility. This man must then be the father. Do you want to get him involved or call him in? But Judith just shook her head. It was a one-night stand, and he even wore protection. But apparently, that wasn't 100% fully proven. Dr. Matthews continued by saying that this predicament did pose an awkward dilemma. Because we now have two girls with two mothers. Judith looked at the DNA results presented on the table before her. She understood the severity of the situation and was glad, in a way, that she was the first and only one to hear this news. But Judith also knew that a difficult conversation needed to follow. Did she want to claim her child? According to Dr. Matthews, she had legal claims to act on this desire if she wanted to, but could she do this to her best friend? About 15 minutes later, Judith stood in the hospital's parking lot. She stared into space and held a copy of the DNA results in her right hand. This would be the hardest decision she ever had to make, and the conversation with Angie afterward would be even harder. She was still in shock and couldn't imagine how her best friend would react. With trembling hands, Judith picked her phone out of her pocket. She could not wait any longer. Angie deserved to know, and she deserved to know right now. The anxious Judith searched for her friend's name and pressed the call. Angie picked up with a happy voice. She was glad to hear from her friend and wondered if she had time for some tea later. But Judith's sad voice changed the conversation vibe. "What's wrong, Judy?" Angie asked her best friend. Judith did not give her friend an answer over the phone. She deserved more than that. Judith simply asked if she could come over, and Angie obliged. On the drive to Angie's house, Judith started to speculate again. She never wanted to become a mother, but the fact that this child was 100% her own might change that. But could she do this to her friend? After a short but nerve-wracking drive, Judith arrived at Angie's house. She knocked on the door twice and waited for her friend to open up. And once Angie did, she immediately saw that her best friend was crying softly. "What is it, honey? Do you want to come in?" Judith didn't say anything and simply nodded while stepping through the doorway. What followed next was heartbreaking for both women involved. Judith sat in a living room chair and waited for Angie to return with tea. The cup was vibrating in Judith's hand so severely that the spoon rattled. Angie placed her hand on Judith's knee and told her to calm down. "It will be all right, just talk." At that point, Brad also entered the room and sat down. Judith explained that the doctor called her earlier in the day. And he had some news. The new parents were instantly captivated because their doctor didn't call them. "What did he say?" Judith explained that the hospital did a DNA test after the babies were born. It's a standard thing with surrogate pregnancies. But out of that test came results that might shock you. It shows that one of the babies is my biological child. Judith also told them about the one-night stand and said she didn't know what to do. The revelation Judith brought into their home shocked both Angie and Brad. They were at a loss for what to do, and they definitely understood Judith's struggle and pain. What they said next was heartbreaking, but also the most kind-hearted thing. The two parents looked at each other and told Judith that if she wanted to claim her child, they would let her. It would hurt them a lot, but the two parents couldn't even finish their sentence because, at that time, Judith had already made her way over to the crib where the two girls were sleeping. The crib stood in the living room, and both parents watched as Judith made kissing sounds with her mouth while leaning over the bed. Judith saw how both girls slept peacefully and content, and then she made the most selfless decision of her life. She turned around and addressed Angie and Brad. Judith said that she couldn't possibly separate the twins. They were born together and needed the chance to grow up together. If she would claim one of them, she would only be thinking about herself. Furthermore, she also couldn't do that to her best friend. You are their parents now, and even though it pains me to say goodbye, I want them to grow up together. Angie and Brad looked at their friend Judith with big, water-filled eyes. They couldn't believe the sacrifice she was making for them. The duo stood up from their chair and hugged Judith with all their might. It was a sad but wonderful moment at the same time. I won't leave them fully, of course. I will always be around, and that little girl can see me as the best aunt a girl could ever have. And that was precisely what happened. The trio found out which daughter was Judith's biological child through the results, and shortly after, they made Judith her godparent. She came by as often as possible and became the best aunt ever. Some years later, the girls have just celebrated their 3rd birthday. Auntie Judith is also there, of course, and she couldn't be happier. They were perfect together, and that's how it should be.